Hey everybody, welcome back to another webinar from the Paul Ecke Ranch. My name is Rebecca Siemonsma. I'm the Technical Services Manager for the Ecke Ranch. Thanks for joining us today for our webinar. Today's topic is Optimizing Branching on Poinsettias. This is session number 2 of our 2010 Summer Poinsettia webinar series. I'm thrilled to let you know that today we also have Jack Williams with us.
Hey everybody, I don't know about you, but can you believe we're really needing to talk about branching on poinsettias? Okay, let's all breathe, let's do it.
Yeah, you know, this webinar is perfectly timed. Most of you should be transplanting rooted cuttings or even pinching some of your larger product forms. And, we'll go through this today and you'll see how truly important it is at this point in the crop where we're really forming the architecture of that plant and all the different aspects of culture that can affect that. So with that, quick housekeeping item. As you know, on our webinars, you can hear us, but we can't hear you. Doesn't mean you still can't ask questions. There is a question and answer toolbar to the right of your screen where we would encourage you to ask questions throughout the presentation. We will stop periodically to address those questions. And then if we have unanswered questions after the webinar, I will contact you via email to address that question. As with all of our webinars, this session is being recorded today. The recorded session can be found at www.com at On Media, and On Media is where we have all of our recorded webinars. And so you just go to On Media, from the pull-down menu you choose webinars, and then the list will come up and you should be able to view it. And this will be available approximately 24 hours after the session. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Jack, and he's going to get us started.
Okay, as we talked about this particular presentation and the things that we needed to really focus on, we've broken it down into these 4 key areas, and so Rebecca and I'll work through these. That first one talking about really how to optimize all the things like branch count, position, strength, the variables that all influence that. From there, we'll take your questions, move to some discussion of pinching techniques and, again, considerations when it comes to that. We'll open it for questions. We'll go through a review of some of the key factors that can have a compromising effect on branching. Those things that, if you're not thinking about it, could have a pretty profound influence on the end results, and so it's always worthwhile. Many of those we'll touch on at earlier points in the presentation, but it's always, again, a good summary and review. And then finally, we'll look at it from the chemical aspect of what's being done regarding branching. So these are the 4 focuses that we will try to target in for you today during our hour with you. So, better branching does mean better plants, and since the majority of poinsettias grown and sold throughout the marketplace are pinch plants, we really want to, again, optimize the end results. When we look at this, there's really 3 key aspects that we're going to hone in on. First of all is getting the branch count that you want, because, again, to meet the specifications for your market, you do need to be able to create the right number of bracts for that specification. Branch position, the architecture of the plant required to minimize the risk of breakage is critical. And some plants genetically are going to be better about that than others. And there are many varieties out there that you're growing and selling in the marketplace that really are at risk for stem breakage. And so we're going to talk about how to maximize that branch position that you're looking for. And then that ties nicely into trying to focus on how do you optimize branch strength. And that's that ability of the plant to hold on to those stems so that you're not losing them and having shrink factors affect you in your end numbers. So with that, let's start talking about branch count. And as a grower, we always know that a lot of this starts with the cutting. And why do we go all the way back to the cutting? It is important that once you receive cuttings, or if you're producing your own cuttings there, that you're really focusing on getting that cutting processed through and into the growing pot as quickly as possible. When rooted cuttings arrive, a lot of growers will set them out, let them acclimate for a day or so, just to try to adjust from that transport they've been through. But there is a risk if you let them sit there more than a day or so that you can harden them off. So if you can start with good cuttings that are not hardened off, and those are ones that, they've come in, if you need to separate them, let them sit out, get them watered through very thoroughly to re-wet the rooting media, That's all great, but at the time of year we're talking about, you're in the hottest time of year. Your greenhouses are not exactly a stress-free zone for the plants, so you really need to get after it. Ideally, those cuttings, when you receive them, have good, healthy white roots. The foliage is flat and free of damage. And when I say flat, a real key that the plant has been through some stress is curling. Either curling up or curling down to the leaves indicates heat or water-related stresses. And so if you're noticing that kind of curling on the cuttings, you want to really mitigate that as quickly as possible. And that way, when you get those cuttings in, there are fewer factors to cause hardening off. Ideally, internodes are not stretched. That means they've been managed well through propagation. Here's where growers get in trouble. If you leave them tight together while you're waiting to transplant, and it takes several days to get that happen, stretch starts to happen, and that stretch can cause you some problems down the road. So let's really start with good cuttings, get them processed, get them planted, so that you have the least amount of issue coming out of that transplant stage. Now, managing the environment is critical. Again, as I've already said, the temperatures for you at this time of year are their most stressful. When I put these numbers up on the screen, I know some of you are already laughing, thinking, okay, day temperatures in the 70s to 80s, that would be nice. We understand that many of you are in geographic regions where very hot day temperatures that go into the 90s, and in some areas even higher, may be very common. So that means, again, you very quickly want to process those cuttings, get them into the pots, because certainly once they're in there, the additional humidity from the soil around the cuttings, the plants being tight together, all those things will help mitigate that. But you may also be needing to mitigate with additional shade on the roof, periodic syringing to cool the temperature of the leaf and the plant to keep that stress off of it. So really manage that day temperature. Now, very few of you would be in a luxury position where you'd have to worry about getting your temperatures up into the 70s to 80s. But I hate to tell you, California growers out in our area, we've had one of the coldest summers on record. We're running about 10 degrees behind normal. So that means we're really dealing with day temperatures that are in the 60s. So if you're in that situation, you may actually be in a position needing to close up the greenhouse, heat it a little bit at night if necessary. So react to the day temperature. Make sure you're coming as close to those optimum temperatures as possible and mitigate the stress through shade and syringing to keep the plant from getting hardened off. Night temperatures, 70s are a good target. Again, high 60s through the 70s. All of those things are important. If you are in an area with high humidity and very high night temperatures, having fans running at night is a good idea, again, to keep the air movement, keep the plants under more airflow going through there, and removing that heat from the plants. Relative humidity for the growers out there in our audience today that are in dry zones. Again, we want to encourage an average relative humidity that's 55% or higher. That means, again, the syringing of the plants. It means washing down the walkways. Putting moisture in the environment there is going to be very beneficial because we want to keep the cuttings soft so that when you do pinch and get to that stage, the stem is still nice and soft and it's going to be easy to produce the branches. For those of you in the humid areas, and we know you're there too, again, keeping airflow moving just keeps that humidity from really building up and being oppressive on the plant, which again can also contribute to a heat-related stress. So keep it moving. Try to manage the humidity to about the 80% level. Light intensity is linked to the temperature in the greenhouse, and so where as a grower, our philosophy is we'd like to see you growing the poinsettias with as much light as possible for a whole host of reasons we'll get into, especially as we talk about stem strength. You are having to shade the greenhouse to mitigate temperature stress. To minimize that stress, understand that the cuttings hopefully have come out of propagation-related conditions where 2,000 foot candles or so has been about the finished out light levels. That way they have not been too dark, too soft, big leaves really prone to damage coming into the higher temperature and higher light areas. Until those plants are established after transplant, keeping them protected more. 3,500 foot candles would be great. Then once you do have them established, pinched, and actively growing, we want to get those light levels up, and that's usually for most of you going to be sometime in September when temperatures may be getting a little bit more manageable. But at that point, the plant is also established, able to pull up water, able to mitigate some of the stress itself. And so at that point, it's very appropriate to get the light levels up. But always, if you're experiencing an unusually hot summer, you may have to be using more shade than what these levels suggest just to be able to mitigate that heat and temperature stress on there. But if you can give it more light, the more light you can get, you will get stronger and better branches out of the poinsettias. So push it. Make sure that you're really checking that and watching to see what you can achieve. Branch position, in focusing that, there is a whole lot of talk about V-shaped architecture and how those upright stems are going to prevent stem breakage. And we are very pleased that varieties like Prestige really kind of solve a lot of that for you. But we know there are a lot of varieties being grown that, again, are sensitive to stem breakage. So getting that upright habit is important. But let's be very clear about this. Just because you can get an upright growth habit on the poinsettia doesn't mean that you can hold on to those stems throughout the production and transport and retail. So it is important that we do as much upfront to assure good upright position. In a little bit, we'll also talk about the feature of building that stem strength to manage it. That branch angle is going to very much dynamically influence whether you get breakage. And clearly, if we can avoid the horizontal branching of many of the varieties, as you see in these images, the one on your left side of the screen, that's a winter rose. Varieties like winter rose and Jester and Prestige, all of those have a very nice upward branch angle. Advent is another one that falls easily in that category, where a lot, I'd say probably the majority of varieties out there, are more like the variety on the right, where you see that more open habit, and that's where we have a greater risk of stem breakage. So we've really got to get those branches going up from the very beginning. So how do most growers do that? They usually play with the spacing of the crop from the very beginning. And that's great. By keeping the plants closer together, we do have the advantage that you've got, again, higher humidity around the plants that mitigates some of the stress from the temperatures and the conditions in the greenhouse. As you pinch, then that moves the branches more in an upright position, because poinsettias are space hogs. And when given the opportunity with adequate space, those side shoots will just go out and find as much light as possible. So keeping them tightly spaced at the beginning is going to help establish an upward growing position on the stems. As you see on the picture, you're still okay here, but those leaves are starting to touch. We're now getting to a point that's going to be very important that the spacing starts to happen. And in many of the large operations where there are so many plants to get spaced, by the time everything gets spaced out, you may have some stretch and other problems that can be equally difficult in maintaining stem integrity at the end of the crop. So use that tight spacing to help force an upright branch position. But understand, if your operation has difficulty in getting them all spaced on time, now I know that every greenhouse does struggle with that at some point, then you might not want to push them pot tight. You may want to give them just a little bit more space around them than that, so that you have the luxury or the option of spending a few more days to get them spaced out and not being at risk of that stretch at the beginning. So keep the plants together. That will help force that position, but again, be wise. If you don't get it all done on time, then leave yourself a little bit of flexibility. Now, genetics, when we talk about stem strength and building that strong plant, genetics have a huge influence on that. So that's where using varieties like Prestige, Prestige Early, all of those can be very, very beneficial in dealing with stem breakage if that's a major issue. Beyond that, for the other poinsettia varieties, one of the most important factors in building a strong stem is going to be how much light can you give that plant. So light intensity is going to, with greater light intensity in there, you're going to get reduced stretch of those young shoots. That way you don't get that real rapid thin growth that, as the stem then starts to be exposed to more light, thickens up and sets up a weak attachment on the plant. You're going to reduce the risk of that. you're going to get an increased caliper of that stem from the very beginning. And again, that avoids that real thin attachment, which is dynamically not as capable of holding on to the stem. And with more light, we're getting more transpiration. We're getting more activity by the plant itself, which means water flow, calcium, the things that are all necessary to get to the growing, developing parts of the plant. The nutrients needed for good, strong growth are actually happening. If you're shaded very heavily, and because of humidity and all those factors, you're not getting much transpiration by the plant, then you're not getting much movement of calcium up into the tissue where you need it. So again, try to give them as much light as you can. If you need to give them additional space to, again, dry them out and cause that transpiration to take place, go for it. If you're mitigating plant stress through that additional shade, again, understand the darker you make it, the easier you make it on the plants, the more at risk you are for some stem strength issues. And you may have to go in and compensate with calcium sprays, other things to compensate for the lack of transpiration and movement of water and nutrients through the plant. You may have to do things like that to help. When we talk about fertilizers, again, using full balanced fertilizers is very important, but if anything, focus more on nitrate nitrogen at this early stage. The ammonium or urea-form nitrogens are going to really encourage a lot of stretch and very rapid expansion of leaves. So that will cause more shading, that will cause more stretch, and if you're not countering that with growth regulators and other cultural practices, it could set you up for weak stems. As always, you need to evaluate in your operation if stem breakage is a continual problem for you. Even using some of these things, then growers are certainly stepping in and mitigating that with various methods of support, whether it's the plastic rings that you just pop on the pot, whether it's the old bamboo and a little bit of string to tie it up, or even some of the banding or use of twist ties or those ways. If you know you have a problem with those varieties, then be prepared to step in and do something at an early stage of the crop to help, again, assure that at the end you're going to minimize that loss of value due to shrink from stem breakage. At this point, this is a good time to take questions, anything we've hit on or not hit on. Let's make sure we've covered your issues there.
Okay, Jack, I've got an interesting question that's come in from a grower that's starting with rooted cuttings, and they're wondering, we talked a lot about the importance of not holding those cuttings over and transplanting immediately so that you don't run the risk of excessively hardening off the tissue. This grower is wondering if you run into a situation where you do have to hold the cuttings, for whatever the circumstances are, would applying a light growth regulator application, help with some of that stretch and some of the hardened tissue? Do you have any thoughts there?
Well, let's take both of those. Certainly to help deal with stretch, it would be better if you're going to have to hold those cuttings, to get them spaced apart. If they're coming in strips, then make sure there's adequate space between the strips so that there's light getting around all the plants. That will be a better factor, because the growth regulator could, again, act to harden the plant off. We have a restricted root system. We don't have a lot of active growth happening on the plant, and so putting on chemicals that are going to stop growth could have a bigger hardening impact than anything else. If you're not able to get the kind of space necessary to really help deal with it, then yes, probably a light application of something like Cycocel is going to be helpful. But let's look at it from that standpoint. And if this is an issue of, did you schedule them in at the right time? Did you schedule enough labor? Whatever it is, you need to look at that as a problem. Do you need to schedule them to come in later in the future, or do you need to have more labor ready and available to get these planted? Really get to the heart of it, because every day you leave them not transplanted, you're setting yourself up for problems. The bigger issue there, hardening off, in that small media that most cuttings arrive in, they're going to dry out quickly. And as they dry out, and let's use Oasis as an example, since that's a product that we use so heavily. If you're not getting in there and watering those strips of Oasis to keep that wet, you're getting a lot of drying down, and you could actually start burning off the ends of the roots quite easily, and so now you're setting it back even further for when you do transplant. The more setback you have like that, the more it's going to harden off. So In this case, if you have to hold them, I'd say the key things are make sure you've spaced them adequately to try to minimize the risk of stretch and allow you to hold them, and also really be aware that you're getting enough water in there to keep the root zone and the rooting media wet so that you're not burning off the roots. I would say be very cautious about going in on those small transplants that have not been transplanted with any kind of heavy fertilizer, and especially an ammonium nitrate type feed. The thought could be, well, ammonium nitrate's going to make them soft and keep them from getting hardened off. The risk you have is that if you're feeding and those are drying down so rapidly, you could burn your roots quite easily, causing you that setback again. And the ammonium could influence more stretch and more leaf expansion, which would lead to more stretch. So, you know, if you're going to have to keep them, space them, keep them watered properly, you could use a light fertilizer, but again, focus more on nitrite and nitrogen.
Okay, we've had another question come in here about when you use supports for the cuttings. Can you talk to us about when the optimal time to apply support rings or whatever you're going to use would be?
Yeah, this one is, you know, you want to have some branches out there, and so, you know, there's no sense trying to put on the rings or anything from the very beginning, because you've got to you'd be constantly training the stems through those supports. So most of the growers out are doing some kind of support work in, I'd say, the first to second week of October at the latest. That's a point where the shoots are coming up and developing. They're still soft enough that if you're putting them, you know, with the plastic ring, you can easily gather the shoots together, put the ring on, let them fall back, and they're usually going to be above where the ring first lays so that you've got the upright position being held. If you're doing the bamboo and string routine, that's also something you probably need to be getting done by mid-October at the very latest. The later we go into the crop, the more at risk you are that those stems are spreading out, and as you pull them up, you're first of all potentially going to start to dislodge a little bit of that vascular attachment, and many times that will end up with this situation, and I'm sure a few of our growers will recognize this when I describe it, that at the end of the crop, all of a sudden the stem just wilts out for no reason. There's no you know, obvious damage, there's no disease or anything else, but all of a sudden that mature stem just wilts and basically abscisses off of the plant. Most of the time it's because very late that stem has been moved dynamically enough that there's been some separation of the vascular tissues there, and as a result, you know, it can only take up water to a certain point, and at the level they have too many leaves, too much growth on that stem to support, and not enough water coming through, then it wilts out. My analogy has always been try using a coffee stirrer to drink water with, or try drinking through a straw. Certainly that coffee stirrer that has those two, you know, just a couple little holes, it's much more difficult, and it's harder to get all that water in there as the plant needs it. So try to get all of that work done in the early October period of time before you really risk a lot of damage to the plant.
All right. Well, it looks like we've covered the questions that have come in. With that, we're going to go ahead and move forward in the presentation. And at this point, I'm going to start talking with you about pinching and the role that pinching plays in the overall architecture of the plant and how those new shoots form. As we all know, pinching does promote lateral branch development, and timing really is everything. As Jack talked about, when we're hardening off those cuttings excessively in the propagation environment or holding them over before we transplant, you know, or letting the cuttings stretch excessively before we pinch or pinch too early, all those things are factors that are going to inhibit how the plant branches. And so we're going to talk about the importance of properly timing that pinch first. The first thing that you want to look at is root establishment. When generally, a general rule to follow would be that when the roots have reached the edge of the pot, the plant's ready to put its energy towards new shoot growth. If you pinch too early, the plant's just not going to have enough energy yet to put into that lateral shoot formation, and you may not get the shoot count that you're looking for. So it is really important to make sure that you schedule the crop accordingly and make sure that you're allowing enough time between pinch and flower initiation and scheduling that pinch when the plant's ready to be pinched. Sometimes, you know, if we run short on a schedule, Growers can get into a situation where the cuttings came in late, or things were, there was propagation issues, just various reasons why schedules don't go the way that we like them to. And if you're finding that you have to compromise that time and pinch before the roots are established, you may notice that you're not getting the break or the shoot count that you're looking for. We're also looking at desired number of nodes when we pinch, and we'll go through this in the next couple of slides about the container size and the desired number of nodes, because nodes equal the number of shoots and, of course, the number of bract counts that you get. So obviously in a 4-inch pot versus an 8 or a 10-inch pot, you're going to be looking for a different node count. The days to the start of short days is the next thing that we want to talk about when it comes to timing a pinch, and that's where we talk about what's called the vegetative growth phase, and that's the time between pinch and flower initiation, where the plant's basically putting on the vegetative growth that it's, that's where all the growth potential is coming from. And so you want to make sure that you have that time scheduled accordingly so that you're allowing enough time for the plant to size before it goes into those short days and starts putting its energy to flowering. So I talked about node count and, timing your pinch to pinch to the appropriate number of nodes. Well, what is an appropriate number of nodes? There is a direct correlation between bract count or shoot count and bract count, and so, certain markets are going to call for different specs for flower count, and so we want to take that into consideration. So that's one factor to consider. And we do have some general guidelines that you can go by when you're deciding what your node count is going to be that you leave after pinch. Generally for 4 and 4.5 inch pots, we recommend leaving 4 to 5 nodes. For 6 to 6.5 inch pots, we recommend 6 to 7 nodes. And then for 7, 8, and 10 inch pots, we recommend leaving 6 to 7 nodes per plant. What I want to point out here on the larger container forms is that you do have multiple plants per pot. And so, right away, growers might be thinking, well, we've got this larger container size. Obviously, it's going to need more height potential, so we want to leave higher nodes, and we want higher bract count. Well, there just really is no advantage to leaving more than 6 to 7 nodes per plant. What happens is you end up with a plant that just has too many branches that it can support and have them all be healthy and not have branch breakage problems. Typically, if you have a situation where you've left, 9, 10 nodes and what we would consider an excessive node count, half of those branches end up breaking off in the end anyway because they form at weak angles. They don't, the shoots towards the bottom of the plant don't receive enough light to get that stem caliper that you're looking for, and breakage becomes a significant issue. So we really do recommend, even on those larger container sizes, that you only go with 6 to 7 nodes per plant. Crop schedule influences when to pinch, so this is where I talked about the vegetative growth phase and that time between pinch and flower initiation, or the time between pinch and the start of short days. And that's going to vary depending on your container size, and you're going to need more vegetative growth the larger container sizes you're growing. So typically for a 6.5 inch pot, it's recommended that you have 14 to 18 days based on vigor of the varieties grown, and this is also going to vary based on geographic locations. Obviously, southern growers can allow less vegetative growth than our northern growers that are dealing with limited light and sometimes cooler temperatures. So, geographic location is going to be a factor, and also the cultivar's natural vigor. For small pots, like your 4 and 4.5 inch pots, usually 10 days is required between pinch and the start of short days. And then for your larger pots, like your 7 and 8 inch, usually we say 18 to 24 days. Now, for additional scheduling information, you can go to Ecke.com, and we do have a document called Scheduling Poinsettias, and that'll kind of walk you through how to schedule pinch, how much time is needed for establishing for the different varieties, and how much is needed for vegetative growth. And then I would also point out in the Ecke catalog, we do list the cultivar's vigor, which is important, and you'll need to know that for scheduling. And then we also list the cultivar's vigor, and that'll help you schedule the crop accordingly. So just again to reiterate, when we're talking about the vegetative growth phase, we need to think about the cultivar's natural vigor, and your geographic location is also going to play a factor here.
And Rebecca, this is maybe a little bit of preview or promoting of the next webinar about initiation. But likewise, look at the varieties, because not all of them induce flower at the same time. So if we were just talking as a general line, many of our early varieties also have an early initiation date. So you wouldn't want to use the same pinch date for that pot size if you're dealing with an early flowering variety with an early initiation compared to a variety with a more standard, September 20th type initiation. So looking at that variety is very important. That's, again, going to be part of the topic of the next webinar. If you're unsure, that'll be a chance to talk and listen more on that, or, start digging into that quickly before you make your schedule set.
Great point, Jack. So we're going to start talking about pinching techniques here, and this slide is a really good example of what the tissue looks like that you're pinching off with the different pinching techniques. We'll be talking about soft, primarily soft and hard pinch, but you can see there with a medium pinch. So with a soft pinch, you're just rolling out that very new growth. You can see that there's new leaves there emerging, but they're not expanded at all. With a medium pinch, you're just removing the tip, and then those leaves have expanded a little bit more. With a hard pinch, we're actually removing the tip and some expanded, fully mature leaves. With a hard pinch, you can see that you're removing the growing tip and all immature leaves and at least one or two fully expanded leaves. You can see not all cultivars respond well to a hard pinch, especially if the environmental conditions are stressful. So the goal really is not to pinch hard if you can help it. In a situation where you can run into where you would have to pinch hard is if you've allowed the cuttings to stress or to stretch excessively prior to pinch, and we're trying to keep that node count down. That would be a situation where you're doing a hard pinch. The repercussions of hard pinching would be like in this picture shown here, where you can get some dominant branching, and you can see the tissue at the bottom of that stem is really hard, and we didn't get those lower lateral branches like we typically would get when the cuttings are pinched, when the vegetative growth is a little bit softer. So, really the stress here, the goal would be to time that pinch accordingly so that you don't have to do a hard pinch. Some cultivars respond and branch pretty well with a hard pinch, but there are some cultivars that, particularly in a summer greenhouse when it's hot and it's bright and maybe sometimes dry, a hard pinch is not going to be the best scenario. So this is where we want to talk about the soft pinch, and that's where you're removing the growing tip and immature leaves, but you're not removing any mature leaves. Immature leaves create the same plant hormones that stimulate the branching, and this is also going to be an attempt to establish the apical dominance. And then when you're doing the soft pinching, we do also recommend removing those last two large leaves at the pinch, but not removing the entire petiole. So you're only removing mid-petiole. And what this does is it really kind of opens up the canopy and allows for maximum light penetration to the canopy, which is what really drives that upright V-shaped architecture. And I'll show that in the next slide. But this picture here is a really good example of what those last two leaves look like when you actually remove those leaves. And again, just pinch it off mid-petiole. That petiole is going to kind of wither up and die and fall off on its own. If you were to remove the entire leaf with the whole petiole, there is the chance that you're kind of creating an extra wound there, where botrytis or, any kind of pathogen can enter the plant. So it's just a good idea. Pinch at the petiole, take those big leaves off, and then you're really opening up the canopy. The other thing that can happen is, we call it elephant ears. When you leave those last two mature leaves like that, they can get excessively large and then really shade the canopy. So it's another good reason to remove those leaves. And this is just a good example here. Leaf removal allows for maximum light penetration, and you can see that, we've practiced leaf removal here. Where my cursor is showing, you can see that half those petioles are left, and you can see that we're really starting to get some lower lateral formation here, and it'll be really nice and V-shaped because we have a nice open canopy.
And, Rebecca, you made a really good point about those elephant ear type leaves. It's really hard to tell today with the varieties out there that have large foliage, large bracts, all those things, whether that leaf at the top after you've done a pinch is really fully expanded or not. And if it's not expanded fully, it is, again, suppressing that branching down below, and then that's when we see those elephant ear type leaves form. So as long as you're able to leave a good 4 nice healthy leaves on the plant, removing those last couple leaves up at the top just for good measure is a great advantage, both to, again, getting the light in there for the structure that we're going for, and again, the stem strength. So make it a practice. It takes more labor, yes, there's no doubt about it, but in the end it is worth it.
Okay, and so this next slide here is really just reiterating what Jack said, where there's two things that we're targeting really, and two key objectives that we're targeting when we're talking about leaf removal. The first would be branch position, and then the second would be branch strength. Obviously, we talked about you're increasing light penetration to the stem. That's enhancing that branched position. You're going to see a lot less horizontal branching that's enhanced when the canopy is shaded, and then when you're removing leaves, you're increasing the light penetration, and you're getting, you're going to get better stem caliper and better stem strength when those stems are receiving more light. And then this is also going to reduce the need for PGRs when you've got good stem strength like that. All right, we do have some questions that have come in. Jack, do you have any comments while I'm looking through the questions?
No, again, just reiterating, there is not a variety out there that I know of that will respond nicely to the leaf removal. So, if you invest that little bit of effort at that stage of the crop, when they're pot-tied, it's easy to get to them, it's easy to pinch, easy to remove the leaves, do it. The other question that does come up is, well, can I pinch and then go back a week later and remove those leaves? And the answer is no. If you're going to do the leaf removal, it needs to happen within the day or two surrounding the pinch. Otherwise, again, the minute you remove that tip, the role of trying to reestablish apical dominance falls to those immature leaves. So if you're going to do it, and I think it's worth it, do it right away. Just train your people, get them to be in there. Now, word of warning, when you talk to your workers about removing a couple leaves, do follow up, because I've been in a few greenhouses where we showed them the technique, got them started, went to look at some other things, came back, and they were virtually stripping the plant. We don't want to remove so many leaves that you're stressing the plant in another way now. So really follow up on it. Make sure people understand exactly what your expectations are.
Jack, we've had a great question that's come in here about fertilizer. In the last section, we talked about the importance of, getting that calcium to move through the plant with the flow of water through the plant. How important is it that we're fertilizing with calcium prior to the pinch?
Well, I made the comment that it's really important that we're getting balanced feed. And so I know when we first started talking about calcium being the saving grace to the old problems like bract edge burn and stem breakage, all those things, there were many growers that went into mode of, well, we're just gonna feed with calcium nitrate and really load it up at that stage. Well, the reality is that plant has only recently come out of propagation. It's only recently got some roots out there to start taking up nutrients. It's down on a lot of things. And calcium, we want to make sure it's there. And if you are in an area where there's no calcium in your water, and there are a few parts of the country where they have very low alkalinity, so no bicarbonates. If you don't have much in your water, then you really want to be sure that you're adding quite a bit to your feed mix, throughout that process. But it has to be a supplement. It shouldn't be the only thing you're focusing on, because equally important are those other elements in there that we're getting, both the minor elements and the major elements that the crop needs. So make sure it's part of your program. Don't make it the only part of your program.
Okay, it looks like we've addressed the questions that have come in with that. I'm going to turn it back over to Jack, and he's going to talk about the different factors that compromise branching.
Yeah. As we said coming into this program today, we've covered some of those, and so in many ways you're going to feel like some of the things we're saying right now are a review. But again, that's why we're having this webinar. It is a good time to review, and every day you walk in that greenhouse and look around at what's happening, you can think, oh, how does this affect the branching? How does this affect the growth that we want to get out of this crop, so that you're doing the right things to mitigate that. We cannot have the discussion without talking about genetics. Today, most of the varieties that are grown and sold commercially in the market are free branching varieties. But there is a distinct difference in those varieties and how easily they branch versus how much more finesse is required to get that. And there are still varieties out there that are sensitive to high temperature stresses that will basically abort some of the side shoots before they even have a chance to form, or will limit their ability for those side shoots to grow if they even start to form after a pinch. So really keep that in mind. If you are growing some of those genetics, then you would want to be sure that you're putting them in areas, if temperature stress is the key thing, you'd want to be sure that you're putting them in an area of the greenhouse that is the most effectively cooled or has a little bit more shade, and again, those temperature issues are mitigated. But also, if we talk about varieties like winter rose, one of our own varieties, that it is not a plant that is going to fill in and branch out like a lot of other poinsettias, then you need to there compensate. And where we talked earlier, Rebecca gave you guidelines on how many nodes to leave at time of pinch. Instead of thinking, okay, I'm just going to leave one or two more nodes, to do that means you're going to wait and do a harder pinch. So really, in those varieties, look at doing that soft pinch, doing that leaf removal as early as possible while the tissue is soft and the most capable of creating branches, and do that instead of adding nodes. Reduce the time from transplant to pinch, do a soft pinch, leave as many nodes as possible with that soft pinch, but take that approach rather than, oh, I'm just going to let it grow. Because what happens? Well, we showed you the picture. What happens? You get dominant branches up top, and the lower shoots don't branch at all, so it doesn't help you there. Environmental stresses, critical. Heat, we keep focusing on because it is the hottest time of the year. Water stress through this is very, very important. And then we're going to get into some of the crop culture things that we as growers manage to do mistakes every year that can really be a factor. So let's look at each one of these. Genetics we're not going to cover more of. You need to look very specifically at what you're growing. But let's talk about the environmental stresses. Water stress, if we think about those cuttings coming in, and this we alluded a little bit in the question about if we're having to hold the plants. You know, one of the dynamics I see during propagation phase and that early transplant phase, if cuttings are allowed to dry down severely, there's a real dehydration that happens, and in many cases the stem starts to shrink in, almost look kind of wrinkly. Some people have described it to me like elephant skin, and becomes very rubbery. And whenever we have the poinsettias stressed to that level, and that's usually a water stress more than anything else, you're going to see a compromise to the branching that will take place. Part of that is that usually it's the softest upper tissue that's still intact after that has happened, and it will, when you pinch, you'll get some branching up at the top. But that central and lower part of the stem where it's really been dehydrated the most, there's the most damage done to the vascular system, that's going to be a real problem. So if your cuttings have dried out that severely, before you pinch and before you work with them, go through it. If they're very rubbery and, again, kind of shrunken and wrinkled looking, understand right up front that you're going to have issues with branching with those plants, and you might want to look at what that number is for you and what you need to do in response to it, and, again, avoid a real heavy water stress. Temperature stress can really harden out the plants. And again, this is where mitigating those stresses is so critical, whether you're holding the cuttings or whether they've just been transplanted. That's why we say give them a little more shade. If you need to, syringe. Don't take the approach of you're just going to water the plants daily and that should cool them and handle that. You know, all you accomplish in doing that in the early stages is oversaturating the soil, and it slows down the root penetration. It slows down how quickly the plant takes off and starts growing to where you can pinch it. Our goal ought to be to get those plants as quickly ready to pinch and start branching as possible so that those kind of issues are really mitigated. So, you know, mitigate the stress. Syringe by just lightly misting and, you know, spraying the plants with water. That's going to be really critical in helping cool the plant tissue and allowing that to evaporate off and take some of that heat stress off. And another factor about that, think about what time of day you're doing that, or if you are going to have to water, look at watering later in the day, not early. First thing in the morning, your plants are not under stress. They've come through the night, it's been dark, it's been humid, they should be fully turgid, everything should be in good shape. Traditionally, we're trained to go in there and water first thing in the morning so that the plants will be fully ready to grow during the day. Well, when you apply that water, you're putting it on a time the plant needs it the least. So for this early period of time, establishing and getting good branching and all these factors, if you're watering as the temperatures are rising and stress is starting to happen, that water's cooling the root zone, it's putting humidity around the plant, all of those things are helping and are all beneficial. The thing that is dangerous here, and we'll show an example of this in a little bit, is if there is fertilizer in that water and you are overhead applying, we are concerned about the impact of phosphorus being in contact with the foliage of the plant. So I have a great slide in a few slides here to show you about what can happen if you're not being aware of that and managing that fertilizer on the foliage as a result. Okay. There's another real serious thing that can happen with high temperatures, and this is usually when the plants are exposed to prolonged periods of time of 90-degree and higher temperature. And so this is more typical in the southern regions of the North American growers' locations, but it can happen in any area where you have prolonged heat. And that's when the phytoplasm that is part of the branching mechanism of the poinsettia can actually be killed by that heat. Phytoplasm is not a virus, it's not a viroid. It acts very much like those organisms, but it is a part of what is dealt with in the poinsettias that stimulates the branching. Well, how do we kill viruses and viroids? Usually prolonged exposure to high temperature will kill those. That's how we get spring plants to be nice and clean. We heat treat the plants to get it to where we can excise the meristem and bring the plants along free of that virus. If you do have day after day, generally it's going to be 10 days or longer prolonged heat like that, you're at risk that some of that phytoplasma could be compromised. And the picture there is a perfect example of what happens. You pinch it at 6 to 7 nodes like you were scheduled to, and you're lucky to get 2, sometimes maybe 3 shoots that come out. This is generally a result that the phytoplasma has been compromised. It may not be all gone, but it's been mostly gone or removed from the plants as a result. And what we see, these plants are usually taller. Well, they're going to be taller because there's fewer shoots, so more energy going into only those shoots. You will notice some lateness in the flowering response time compared to the variety that it's supposed to be. And oftentimes you'll even see slight differences in the foliage and other characteristics of the plant. When the phytoplasma is introduced to the seedlings, that usually will change the plant mildly, but the major change is it creates the branching. So high temperature exposure over a prolonged period of time puts you at risk of phytoplasma basically being killed. So that's where, again, mitigating that stress. You can create a microclimate. You can work with the plant material to take the stress off the plant. It doesn't matter that the day temperatures and the air temperatures are that warm. If you're able to create an environment around the plant where there's higher humidity, cooler temperatures because you're syringing, doing all those things, you're able to basically work that plant through and promote getting through the branching process without issues with the phytoplasma. Again, water stress, that comes from several things. Poorly managed irrigation, if you're just not watering it properly. Poor quality growing media. I've seen a lot of medias that are just, so loose that they dry out so fast that it's difficult for the grower to really get a good root system going. And likewise, a growing media that is so tight that you only have a chance to water about once a week, and in that you cause lots of problems. High temperature stress in the root zone. This is something I see happening a lot, and especially as those plants are pinched and exposed and you're increasing your light levels, you may actually be raising the temperature in the media to the mid-80 or higher level that shuts the root system down. And we've all seen a factor where on the side of our bench, where those pots are the most exposed, you may actually be cooking the roots on that side of the pot. So this is where, again, watering at a midday point allows you to cool the media, keep the roots active, keep the plant growing, because if you're killing off the roots, not by disease, but by just sheer cooking them with high temperature in the soil, that plant's not going to grow, and that's not going to branch properly. So really be watching for that. Again, have a soil thermometer. Put it in there. If you're starting to get temperatures in the root zone area that exceed 85 degrees, you need to be on an irrigation program where midday you're going in and putting in enough irrigation water that it drops that temperature back down so the roots can stay active and the plant continues to grow. Poor quality irrigation water, high salts, high minerals, any of those things, or a combination of all of these can cause hardening that ultimately causes the plant not to branch properly. That generally, another factor with that moisture level can be low relative humidity, and especially in highlight greenhouses. Growers in Colorado and and parts of the country where you have really high light and also dry conditions, that humidity can get down so low that you really harden off the stem and you're not getting the branching. Every year, Rebecca, we all get questions about, should I be misting extra at the time of pinch? Should I be, what should I be doing? Very clearly, we want to keep our humidity levels up around the plant so that at the time of pinch, we're getting good branching. So if you're in a dry environment where that's not typical, you need to be in there mitigating for that and keep that in mind. Or if this year is just an extremely dry season, you're in an area where there's less rainfall, somewhat of a drought situation happening that's not typical, again, that translates into the greenhouse. You need to mitigate for that. When we talk about poor crop culture, this is where we get sloppy as growers, and it's things that we're doing that compromise the ability of the plant to branch properly. We're going to focus on light intensity, spacing, fertilization, and the use, or in this case, the lack of use of growth regulators. So to minimize plant stress, and this is taking one step back, this is very important for the young cuttings when you get them. On those, miss the transplants during the warmest part of the day until they have a good established root system. That's going to help, again, create humidity, cool the tissue, allow the plant to continue to work through there. If you are starting with cuttings in Oasis, anyone buying product from Ecke Ranch is getting it that way as a rooted cutting, or from other suppliers that use that. It is important that you look, when you do your transplant, most of you irrigate after that to get a nice contact of the Oasis to the soil so those roots can move in there. But the Oasis is going to start to dry out quite quickly. Rock wool medias can do the very same thing. So it is important for that first week or so that you're putting some water down around the cube on a daily basis. Not enough to wet the entire growing media, but just enough to keep that Oasis or that rock wool moist so that it doesn't stop the roots from growing out, allows them to penetrate out. So be sure that if you're starting in those medias, that on a daily basis you're putting a little bit of water down around the base of the stem so it's getting into the media, it's keeping that Oasis or rock wool moist so the roots will penetrate and start to grow into the new soil. I've already talked about consider adjusting your irrigation schedules to being afternoon or very late morning depending on your conditions, so you have that cool water coming onto the plant, onto the soil to cool the root zone and keep the roots functioning and active. And again, it's amazing how much of this problem we're seeing around the country, especially if you're growing in darker pots, if you have plants in black trays, if you're on black benches, anything like that that absorbs heat. Very quickly, those little plants can be solar collectors and you can cook your root systems fast. So use that later in the day irrigation as a way to mitigate that. And even if you are having to put a little bit of water every day, just, again, try not to saturate the media every day. Just enough to drop the temperature, to make that change to keep the roots coming along. You may have to, once a week, give a more thorough irrigation, but respond to those temperatures. Don't let them cook the roots and slow down the plant. And again, in dry areas, a great tool, wet down the walkway so you're building humidity. Heck, there's nothing wrong with having the cleanest greenhouse floors in your area. Water them down, mist it down, it builds that humidity, it'll instantly take off some of that stress. Low light. Well, when we talk about mitigating stress with shade during that early stage, going too low in your light levels is going to be a problem, especially causing branches that are not getting enough light, so they are starting to stretch, get very thin. Those are instantly at risk of breaking off. The other dynamic here is that if you are in a low light situation, generally the plants are close together, there's leaves covering up the lower part of the plant, so those lower shoots are not getting much light. You're going to again see a lot of dominance in the upper shoots of the plant. They're taking all the light, they're growing, that's where the plant activity is going, because again, as we talked about earlier, under lower light, You're not getting as much transpiration by the plant. You're not getting as much activity. You're not getting as much growth. So those upper shoots very quickly become dominant. And the lower shoots, if they fully form, they generally will be thin and weaken the attachment. And oftentimes, these are those shoots that never come up to the top of the plant. Every year we hear from growers that have this situation where they pinched it, 6 to 7 notes, they got maybe 3 or 4 really good branches and bracts up at the top, and then there's a couple that the branch formed, but it just never really made its way up to the top. And this low light condition could be part of that. So here's where having higher light, more space around the plants, all those things helps to get that light down to the bottom part of the stem and encourage the growth of those lower shoots to come on up. Lack of space accomplishes some of the same thing. Keeping the plants too tightly spaced for too long, again, allows for that stretching of those lower shoots. And again, generally they're not as aggressive as the upper shoots where they're getting light. So you get into that dominant up top, thin, weak attachments at the bottom, and thin shoots at the bottom that never come up. So if you have those conditions, you're setting yourself up for problems. This is, again, where we said maybe don't space them pot tight. You have maybe an inch or two between each pot so that they're close enough to help encourage the upward branch position, but also far enough away that as you're spacing and working with the plants that are actively growing, they have enough light around them, they have enough air around them, that they don't get into some of the problems that we've just described. Fertilizer. Remember I promised a slide that would show you what happens from overhead irrigation with fertilizers that contain phosphorus. And you notice right up front that the young leaves at the top are very distorted. You feel them, they're going to be very leathery in texture. And also a really good diagnostic tip is if you look at the growing tip and it looks hard and it has a reddish color to it. That's very classic damage from overhead irrigation with phosphorus. If you are having to overhead irrigate, and many of us have to do that in the early establishment stages, if you're going through there with the fertilizers, when you are done, go back and rinse them off immediately with clear water so that you get that phosphorus out of the growing tip and don't cause this problem to happen. Now when we talk about no growth regulating, because we talked about growth regulator being an issue here, those growth regulators are helpful too to help even up the branches. So those dominant shoots we've talked about already, if they get started, we've got to slow them down so the lower shoots can catch up and get up there. And at this point where the leaves are covering up those lower shoots, a spray application of the growth regulator will target the upper ones and help allow those lower ones to work their way up to the top and get a more uniform, even branch position. So sprays can help target the dominant shoots. There are vigorous varieties out there that really will benefit from some treatments, and I know Rebecca will talk about this later, but even treatments before you pinch can be beneficial, whether it's to induce branching with something like Florel or D9 cycocel, those materials to help really set up a better branching pattern and less stretch, so going for better strength. So again, questions at this point. Rebecca, have we had anything come in?
Yeah, we've got kind of an interesting question come in that I'm curious about the answer as well. So we've talked a little bit about growth regulating and the need for possibly growth regulating before pinch, and that would probably be in a situation where your lower laterals are starting to form and stretch possibly. This grower is asking if you run into that situation where you have a variety that has put on some lower laterals before the pinch or even after the pinch and they're really stretching. If you were to remove those lower laterals, would you get breaking from the bottom of the plant again after you remove those stretched lower laterals?
Yeah, that's a great question. And our experience is that it's going to be somewhat variety specific whether you can get that re-branching, regrowth. But I would say with most of the varieties in the market today, the answer is no. So if you have gotten that real weak stretched growth and you think your best defense at that point is to take it off the plant, pretty much understand that you're not likely to get any return. It's a rare factor where you're going to see that plant will produce another shoot from that same leaf axil area.
Okay. Just can we talk real quickly about how we talked about the phosphorus damage in the foliage and how that can inhibit branching. It's something that is fairly common in greenhouses today. Can we talk briefly about how you can get the plant to grow out of that if a grower does see something that they think is phosphorus damage?
Yeah. It all comes down to exposure. If you're seeing that, you've got, and you are overhead irrigating, that's one way, you know, if it's got the phosphorus in it, then what you can look at is switching to feeds like the 14014, 15015, even going to something with a much lower phosphorus level of 14.5, 14, something like that, is going to be better than the 20-20-20 or 20-10-20 that you may already be using. So reducing the phosphorus in the fertilizer that you have will help, but again, then going back through and quickly rinsing, whether you do that with mist or if you just go back in and syringe with clear water. Once you stop having the exposure of the phosphorus on the tissue, there's chances for recovery. If you've done it, you know, a lot. I mean, that during the summer it's hot, so it dries very quickly. It's absorbed very quickly, so you know you can very quickly get into trouble. As long as the damage hasn't gotten to the point of almost chemically pinching the plant, you can generally recover it just by stopping that exposure. But let's be also real frank. Fertilizer is not the only source of where that could come from. There are some growers that are treating their water because of high alkalinity, and if they're using a phosphoric acid as that source, that phosphorus in the water now as a result of the treatment is enough to cause a problem as well. So if you are treating for alkalinity using phosphoric acid, the questions you certainly should go through: should I consider using sulfuric acid instead or nitric acid instead? It's a different formulation or calculation because of the different percentage and the strength of the materials we're talking about, but eliminate that as quickly as possible. This is not where I would come in and spray fascination or do things like that. You know, again, what has happened is when we have that phosphorus there, it's doing several things. It's burning the tissue, but it's also inhibiting the ability of the plant to use some of the other minor elements, the zinc, the manganese, those materials. And so you have, in essence, a minor element deficiency in addition to tissue damage. The only way you're going to recover that is to eliminate the exposure, make sure that you're creating, again, the opportunity for soft growth. So that's where, again, ammonium nitrate might be helpful, maybe a shot of that or two, but eliminate any phosphorus, and always rinse the tissue afterwards to make sure you've really gotten it out clean. As long as you haven't really locked it down, it will recover. It will take longer. You're going to be behind schedule. And as I said, sometimes I've seen it actually chemically pinch the plant to where your side shoots are already growing out. The problem is if you don't recognize it in time, the tips of those side shoots are going to be equally impacted by the phosphorus damage as well. So really pay attention to this one in your problem.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, Jack, is, you know, if the plant's already stressed from phosphorus damage, the best thing you can do at that point is to minimize other plant stresses too. So, you know, if the environment's stressful, if there's low moisture availability, if there's high light, if there's high heat, all those things are going to inhibit the plant from growing out of it faster. So anything that you can do to maximize vegetative growth and soften up vegetative growth with your environment and with your cultural practices, that's going to help the plant grow out of it faster.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, with that, we're going to move on to our last topic of the day, and that is the question of the day: is Florel necessary? There was a time when Florel was considered necessary, and you know there was a lot of promotion of Florel by a lot of different technical representatives and a lot of different companies, and you know that really it was the way to go to maximize branching on your poinsettia crop. One of the things that I will say is that most modern cultivars do branch nicely without the use of Florel. And, you know, there are some exceptions to that, but most modern cultivars that most of the companies have on the market today, even without Florel, and if you're following good cultural practices and good pinching techniques, you will get good branching without the use of Florel. There are some cultivars like Winter Rose that do benefit from an application. Winter Rose is just one of those varieties that it just has less branching potential than other varieties, and so it is one that you could consider the use of Florel. it does have some mild growth regulator effects, and it is cost effective compared to something like Cyclocell. So, that is one of the factors to consider when you're going to decide whether or not to use Florel. So when we talk about the use of Florel and enhancing branching, we'd be talking about using it in what we call the sandwich technique. And it's called the sandwich technique because you're using it prior to pinch and post-pinch. Now, when you're using it prior to pinch, it's applied as a spray 3 to 5 days prior to pinch at 250 to 500 parts per million. And this first pinch is what's going to stimulate the branching. This is where you're getting that ethereal effect in the plant and when the branching is stimulated. Then the second pinch is applied 3 to 5 days post-pinch at 250 to 500 parts per million. Now this second application is where you're evening up the branches that are coming out and you're getting less instances of dominant shoots. So again, first application is the stimulation of branching. The second application is where you're evening out those shoots that are emerging. Some tips for success when you're using Florel. It will be less effective when environmental conditions are stressful and higher rates may be needed in high heat, low relative humidity, and high light. So summer greenhouses. Basically if you're not able to manage your environment as best as you would hope to, then you may, if you're only using that 250 part per million, you may not see the benefits of that if the environment is stressful. And when it's applied to compact cultivars like winter rose, additional growth regulating shouldn't be needed because, as I said, it does have some mild growth regulator effects. So if you're using the sandwich technique on something like winter rose or orange spice or strawberries and cream or some of those real compact cultivars, you definitely will probably not have to use additional growth regulating, or definitely you want to look at your, if you typically come in after pinch, 7 to 10 days after pinch, or 2 to 3 weeks after pinch with a B9 Cyclocell application, likely on these compact cultivars where you've made a Florel application, then you definitely want to avoid growth regulating, or make sure you're using your graphical tracking to see if the plant's within the height range, and then maybe it's still necessary depending on your environment, but that's a good tool to use to take the guesswork out of it. Other growth regulator considerations, this is where we would talk about stretching of those lower laterals and the impact that growth regulating has on branching, and particularly those lower laterals, because if they start to stretch, they're going to be the ones that are weaker later in production. Applications can be made prior to pinch on some of your more varieties that I would call grassy, like Snowcap, Autumn Red, maybe Red Velveteen, Visions of Grandeur, if any of you have had experience with Visions of Grandeur. They are vigorous cultivars with some pretty beastie growth potential, and they can stretch pretty readily, and they have some real soft, it's just the nature of the plant, is that they do have real soft vegetative growth, and applications prior to pinch will help tone up those lower laterals, keep them more toned, so that they have more potential to intercept light and that they don't, form at those horizontal angles that are more susceptible to breaking later. Rates to consider are going to be different depending on your environmental or your geographic location. Southern growers can typically get away with 2,500 parts per million Cyclocell and 1,500 parts B9. I'm sorry, I said that backwards. Cyclocell and B9. Yep, said it backwards. And then your central and northern growers can use 1,500 parts per million Cyclocell and 1,500 parts per million B9. What I point out here is just keep in mind that you can continue to use that B9 Cyclocell application until the start of short days, at which point you need to stop that. And it's a good point that Jack made earlier about not all cultivars initiate on September 25th. So know which variety you're working with and make sure that the B9 has been discontinued when that plant initiates. So if it's like Freedom or Prestige Early Red, they typically initiate approximately September 15th, so make sure that you're done using that B9 at that point. The Cyclocell, however, can continue as long as the days continue to stay warm and relatively long. Southern growers can typically get away with using Cyclocell a little bit longer. I've talked to southern growers that can even do it into about October 20th. For you northern growers, the key is usually, the rule of thumb is usually October 15th, that you should stop that Cyclocell application so that you don't run the risk of bract reduction. But again, these early growth regulators are really designed, if necessary, to tone those lower laterals that might be emerging before the pinch. You want to keep them nice and toned so that they're not weak and susceptible to stem breakage later. I'm going to go through questions. Any additional comments, Jack, while I'm looking through the questions?
No, I think the opportunity to use the application before pinching is something, if you haven't explored it, you need to really look into, because we know that with these growth regulators, it takes a day or two for that to get active in the plant. And so If you're treating before pinch, you have the opportunity for that material to move into the plant, get active, so as those shoots are emerging, you have a little bit of that control in there, and again, you're helping set up a good, thick, heavy caliper and lack of stretch in those side shoots. And so there's some real benefits to be had there. If you haven't tried it, we encourage you to play with that this year.
Okay, we've had one last question come in about the start of short days, and is it 9/21? Typically, most commercial cultivars, or most mid to late season cultivars, I should say, initiate on approximately the autumnal equinox, which is at or around September 25th. Most early cultivars on the market, so like Freedom, Prestige, Jester, even Early Freedom, Autumn Red, Advent, some of those early ones from Ecke, I'm speaking now, initiate approximately September 15th. So, you're looking at the start of short days beginning anywhere from September 15th through the month of September.
Temperature in your region can influence that. If you're in the south, even though the day length has certainly gotten to the point where it's possible, many of the southern growers don't see initiation actually happen until later into October because of the high temperature. So understand, if you're in a high temperature area, you may be at risk of a later induction. If you're in the north and it's cold, it may be earlier. So, again, this is great setup to the next webinar that we're going to talk about those factors.
Right. Another question that's come in here, if you're using B9 Cycocell before the pinch, should you also be using Florel? I guess I would say that definitely depends on the variety for sure. If it's those compact varieties, you're going to be going way overboard if you use B9 Cycocell before and the Florel application. So, know the varieties that you're thinking about doing it for, and think about what, why you're doing that early application too. And if it's to prevent those lower laterals from stretching before pinch, and you're starting to see some lower lateral formation, and you don't want those to stretch, using Florel also is not going to be overkill on a variety that warrants that type of growth regulating. I think would be the best way to say that.
I think, as you just said, Rebecca, look at the plants. If you're already seeing swelling, if you're already seeing shoot growth, you're going to have to be more aggressive before the pinch takes place and get in there. If you're not seeing that, again, don't overdo it with chemicals. So take a look at the plants and see what you're dealing with.
Yep. Well, it looks like we've answered all the questions that have come in today. I would just like to leave you with a few little bits of information. As always, you can find production guidelines and detailed crop information at ecke.com. And then we also have on board our live interactive bulletin board. If you've never been to on board and checked out the Poinsettias forum, now's a great time to do that. We've got a lot of interaction going on right there right now on the board. And then On Target is our free web-based height tracking program that I did mention during the program today. Height tracking takes the guesswork out of knowing when it's time to growth regulate. So, and just make sure that you're hitting those target specs. And as I said, it is a free web-based program. As Jack mentioned, we do have some webinars coming up. I did say this was a 5-part series. We have added an additional 6th webinar that we'll be doing this year. In August, the end of August, we're doing Understanding Poinsettia Flower Initiation. In September, we're doing Poinsettia Growth Regulating. In September, we're also doing Increased Profits with Ecke Cold Grow. And then in October, we'll be touching on finishing and post-harvest handling. So watch your emails for the invites for those webinars. We also have 3 road shows left. Hopefully most of you have heard about the road shows that we're doing this year. Ecke's bringing the pack trials to our customers throughout different geographic locations in the country. We have one tomorrow in Hudsonville, Michigan. So if you're in the Michigan area, you could call the Ecke Ranch to get more information and to register for that event. Thursday we'll be in Cresco, Iowa on August 5th. And then Tuesday, August 10th, we'll be in Lafayette, Colorado. And, just as I mentioned, this session is being recorded, and in about 24 hours we'll have it live on Media. So if you want to go back and share it with more growers in your organization or view it yourself, it should be there for you to view. On behalf of the entire staff at the Ecke Ranch, I'd like to thank you for your time today. It was our pleasure to have you with us, and we hope you join us back for the rest of the sessions. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.